late 1700s and early 1800s, European settlers, mainly Spanish, traveled overseas and began settling in what is now called the Los Angeles Basin, which was solely inhabited by the Tongva Gabrielino tribe. When the natives realized that the Spaniards planned to stay and settle their land, fighting broke out. As the settlers established forts and missions, the native peoples were forced to either cooperate or move away. Many natives eventually became dependent, which gave the settlers the authority to treat them however they pleased. Those who did not cooperate were punished with incarceration and death. Also, by this time, the settlers had taken over most of the land available, leaving only small portions for the natives. In order to make their presence permanent, the settlers built homes, established communities, and raised families. This process of permanently settling a land through domination, removal, and replacement is called settler colonialism. Very soon after the settlers arrived, the natives found themselves landless, powerless, and dependent on the new settler society that had systematically taken over. In Los Angeles' new settler society, white people had the power and privilege. All of the minorities either assimilated and tried to become white, or were subjugated and kept at the bottom of the power hierarchy. Social leaders had an ideal type of settler that they believed was the anchor of U.S. society. They wanted a white male citizen who had a steady job, owned a home, and led a hetero-patriarchal nuclear family. Anyone who did not fit this image was outwardly discriminated against. One example of this discrimination is evident in the tramp era from around 1870 to 1910. With the rise of capitalism, many white men from farm and artisan careers lost their jobs and were forced to find seasonal jobs in the industrializing West. A large number of these tramps traveled to Los Angeles for work in the winter season, especially because of the nice weather. Social leaders realized their city of angels was being taken over by these tramps, who did not fit into the ideal member of society. Even though they were white, they fell short of all the other requirements for ideal citizens. They worked seasonally, did not own land, and were single. This brings us to the concept of whiteness. Being considered white did not just mean being physically white. It meant having privilege, power, and property. Basically, it went beyond race, as shown by the discrimination of tramps, poor white men who, despite their skin color, were subjugated and segregated. For a settler colonial society to succeed, it needs a dependent, subjugated labor force to get the brunt work done. The early settlers used African American slaves as their labor force, but after the 13th Amendment, they had to find a new source of labor. So, they started using public order charges to arrest the outsiders of society and force them to work. The incarceration of large numbers of tramps displayed how this system worked. The police basically arrested anyone loitering on the streets, whether they had committed a serious crime or not. Those arrested could either pay bail or serve time in jail, but since the tramps were seasonal workers without homes, none of them could afford to pay their way out. During the days, they were sent out into Los Angeles in groups called chain gangs. The chain gangs built the city's infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, and parks. Not only did the prison system provide free labor, it also created a profitable industry with countless job opportunities. In order to run the system, there needed to be police officers, jailers, guards, lawyers, businessmen, etc. City officials found that they could actually make money off of the incarceration of unwanted individuals. This system is now called the prison industrial complex, where powerful individuals benefit at the expense of the inmate population. Beginning in the late 1800s and continuing up to the present day, large numbers of Chinese and Mexican immigrants have been flooding into both Los Angeles and the United States as a whole, both legally and illegally. At first, the new sources of cheap labor were welcomed. However, as they began settling in and taking jobs, people quickly began to dislike the outsiders. Legislation and Supreme Court cases such as the Geary Act and Wong v. U.S. were established in order to cut off the flow of unwanted immigrants. But since many immigrants had already settled in, officials had to find a way to target them and kick them out. So, they started using public order charges again, as well as random, unwarranted arrests based on appearance. Any simple mistake, such as not using a turn signal or not stopping fully at a stop sign, could result in arrest. Once an individual was arrested, they were placed in detention without any concrete reason or release date. Since most of them are technically not criminals, they do not receive the normal rights any incarcerated individual would receive. This gives them no legal power, which basically forces them to obey without question inside these facilities. If they try to resist unfair circumstances, they could be physically punished or even deported. These extremely discriminatory practices of immigration control have been going on for years and unfortunately still occur today. One of the most famous cases of discrimination has to do with the mistreatment of the African American community. In the early 1900s, black settlement in Los Angeles grew immensely. With opposition mounting, white real estate developers and homeowners only allowed blacks to purchase homes in a section in the city called Central Avenue District. During the day, they were allowed to travel to work in the white parts of town, but when night came, they were expected to stay in their district. If found on the streets of a white neighborhood, they would be harassed and possibly arrested. Cities that operated like this were called sunset towns. In addition, the police over-patrolled the Central Avenue District, punishing the vice in this district and not in the white neighborhoods. Not only did they over-police this district, they also allowed and even encouraged police brutality on the black community. One explicit example of the brutality is seen in the case of Sam Faulkner. Officers Sheffield and Randolph busted into a middle-class black family's home, intoxicated and without reason. When Sheffield saw Faulkner's head peeking around a corner, he shot and killed him. Faulkner was neither armed nor wanted by the police. Sheffield had also planted drugs in the house to make the mission seem legitimate. Incidents like this plagued the Central Avenue District, and eventually the community fought back with the Watts Rebellion. Thousands of protesters took to the streets, destroying everything in sight. 6 days later, 34 people were dead and thousands arrested, mostly from the black community. Later on, the mayor promised to put more money into healthcare and education, but instead put that money toward policing. This problem of over-policing and brutality in African American communities is not a problem of the past. It still happens today. In order to change this pattern of discrimination, we as a society need to promote intersectionality and discourage enforced forgetfulness. We must show that the systems of discrimination against different societal groups are all related and interconnected, calling for solidarity and cohesion. We need to continue to educate the public on these issues so that history doesn't repeat itself.